This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. Free monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.
And welcome to the monthly public presentation of the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii. I'd like to invite Mark Ferguson, the CEO and Chief Vegetarian Officer of Down to Earth Organic and Natural, whose generous support has made it possible for the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii to bring Dr. and Mrs. Campbell to Hawaii, to say a few words. Mark?
Thanks, Lorraine. Just when I was driving here tonight, I thought, like, where are all these people going? And then where can you park? Down to Earth is, we've been a long-term vegetarian company, and we've had a long partnership with the Vegetarian Society going over many decades. And we're very happy to sponsor Dr. Campbell coming to Hawaii. Thank you all for coming and attending this event. Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Campbell.
Thank you, Mark Ferguson. Now, I'd like to invite one of Hawaii's living treasures, Dr. Terry Shintani, to come up to the podium now.
I want to thank the Vegetarian Society and Down to Earth for allowing me the honor of saying a couple of words about Dr. Campbell. I've known Dr. Campbell since the early 90s, since I learned about his research, which is hailed as the Grand Prix of all nutrition research projects. I've considered him a mentor and a true hero in the field of nutrition, and he's truly legendary. He's been very kind to write the foreword to my new book, which is coming out next month. And now I just wanted to, on behalf of the Vegetarian Society of Down to Earth and myself and the Hawaii Health Foundation, I wanted to give Dr. Campbell a Hawaiian welcome with this Maile Lei.
So thank you very much, Dr. Shintani. Now, finally, Hawaii State Senator Mike Gabbard has come this evening to make a special presentation, and I'd like to invite him to the podium at this time.
Hello, mai kako. It's nice to be here. It's nice to meet Dr. Campbell in person, one of my heroes. I want to just give a quick legislative update that's going to take about a minute for those of you that have been here that have been helping with some of the bills we've been working on at the legislature. We've been in contact with the Superintendent, Catherine Matioshi of the Department of Education. I've been working with the Dr. Bill, Lorraine, the leadership of Vegetarian Society to get some plant-based school lunches going here. And I did receive this, and I'd just like to read this one quote. At the end of September, I got a letter back from the superintendent saying, and I quote, "Since our cycle menu fruit and vegetable offerings every day and non-meat protein selections within the cycle menu, we are happy to report that any day of the week can be meatless if a student so desires. This supports the DOE's commitment to offering healthy choices every day in accordance with the USDA meal pattern requirements that dictates the protein portion size and calories appropriate by age group," unquote. In addition to that, Glenna Owens, who's the person in charge of the school food services branch, she has reached out to us just a couple weeks ago and asked to sit down with anyone that's interested in having plant-based school lunches. And so we'll continue to work with them to make this a reality. The second piece of legislation that I introduced last year that actually passed in the Senate, unfortunately it did not pass in the House, would be to require doctors to take some continuing education in nutrition and lifestyle choices. And I think, Dr. Campbell, what they need to do is enroll in your online course through eCornell, that would be a great idea. And then finally, I have a short presentation. Dr. Campbell, if you would come up here. This is from the Senate honoring and commending Dr. T. Colin Campbell. The Senate of the State of Hawaii hereby honors and commends T. Colin Campbell for his dedicated efforts to improve health and quality of life with plant-based diets. E komo mai, it means welcome, to Hawaii, and mahalo for bringing your message of aloha here for the well-being of all. Congratulations. We're going to take a picture, I think, right here.
Thank you very much, Senator Gabbard, for everything that you've been doing in the legislative field. It's now time to introduce our special guest. We're thrilled tonight to have with us T. Colin Campbell, PhD. Dr. Campbell is the Jacob Gould Sherman Professor Emeritus of Nutritional Biochemistry at Cornell University and the author, with his son and co-author, Thomas Campbell II, MD, of the China Study, the most comprehensive study of nutrition ever conducted, and the startling implications for diet, weight loss, and long-term health. A landmark work which over the past nearly 10 years has launched the whole foods, plant-based diets and lifestyles of countless people worldwide. And with contributor Howard Jacobson, Whole, Rethinking the Science of Nutrition. He received his training in nutrition, biochemistry, and toxicology at Cornell University. And since 1983, he has been the director of the Nutrition and Cancer Program Project, a collaborative project of Cornell University, the Chinese Academy of Preventive Medicine, the Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences, the China Cancer Institute, and the University of Oxford. He has authored over 300 research papers and is the recipient of a number of awards, both in research and citizenship. He is also featured in the well-known film Forks Over Knives. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Campbell.
Thank you so much. I don't know where to start after this reception. This is incredible. It's a tremendous pleasure for me to be here, to be talking to all of you, and to hear too that you are the largest vegetarian society in the United States, I think. Is that correct? If I heard it right. But before I start, I want to, of course, extend my thanks too to the people who put this on, Down to Earth, the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, and particularly certain individuals, Dr. Bill Harris, whom I've known for some years, Dr. Ruth Heydrich, and Dr. Terry Shintani in particular. Dr. Heydrich and Dr. Shintani, as Dr. Shintani already indicated for himself, actually lectured in my course at Cornell University. Now, we've been friends and colleagues for a long time, and anything that Terry does, I'll sign. No, he's really had a very distinguished career in doing what he does. I'm from the scientific community, as many of you may know. I cut my teeth, in a sense, as far as this information is concerned, coming up through the scientific ranks. And I'm a researcher. I'm not a practitioner, essentially in medicine, but I'm a researcher. When I've gotten started in this field now, actually over 58 years ago, I must say, been around quite a while, I started out with an idea at that time, or impression, or if you will, that was very different from what I now have. And so the journey for me, with lots of students and colleagues and fellow professors and colleagues and other sorts of people, has been very exciting, because as I went through the years, I ended up with some ideas that are really quite different from where I started to begin with. So now I'm actually, at this point in time, very passionate about this idea. And I'm passionate because here's an idea that this time has come. It's not a new idea. It's at least 2,500 years old. It goes back to the ancient Greeks, actually. And through the centuries, There were significant scientists and medical people from time to time who were acknowledging the possibility that eating this way made a difference as far as health is concerned. But now we're in a position we've got to talk about it seriously. And I'm interested in going beyond the choir, if you will. I want to actually get it for the population at large, for the worldwide. I'm very much aware that there are a lot of forces in the world who would not particularly care to see this information out there. Lorraine, you gave the address that I gave to you, but I decided to change it at the last minute. I decided to call it that, just to give a little more emphasis to this. It's actually, for a lot of people in the professional communities, as you may know, whether it's in science, in medical science in particular, or elsewhere, this actually is almost a secret. Now, to start this, and just to illustrate why I get passionate about this and why I think we all should really get serious about this, this is a publication in 2009 by an official organization associated with the United Nations comparing different countries, the United States included, of course, different countries in the Western world with respect to the cost of health care. And I'm sure many of you are very, very much aware that the cost of health care in the United States is pretty serious. It's going through the roof. You can see here that the United States outpaces all the other Western countries. And I've actually been lecturing in some of these countries, and I have some ideas about this disparity. But we spend more per capita than any other country in the world, and we're about twice as high as any other country. In reality, spending all that money, we don't get the return that we should be getting. Actually, we're working with a really bad business model. We're spending a lot of money and not getting the return that we ought to be getting. There's many different ways you can sort of look at this question and see that what I'm talking about here. This is just one way here. It's the life expectancy for the United States compared to the other countries. So I would ask the question, how come we spend so much money and get so little in return, just as indicated by the one metric there, in addition to other things? This sheds a little light. The United States leads the rest of the world in the use of pharmaceuticals. So here we are. We're spending lots of money. We're trying to keep ourselves healthy by using drugs. That's the problem. So my question is, what's the solution? The solution is, in fact, understanding nutrition. Now, if I were to introduce this idea of nutrition, an old idea, but if we were to want to describe what it is in the present day, the public is very confused about nutrition. And part of that is due to the fact we don't teach nutrition in medical schools. Why weren't they taught in that medical school? The community I'm in is not directly in the medical practitioner community. I'm in sort of the biomedical research community, if you will. We get funding from the public, and we do research, and we're trying to supposedly look for what the answers are and try to describe the way things are. And is principally organized through the National Institutes of Health, NIH. NIH is made up of 28 different institutes. There's the Cancer Institute, the Heart Institute, Institute on Aging, and so forth and so on. You know, we have 28 institutes at NIH, the largest biomedical research agency in the world. We've got 28 institutes. Not one is called the Institute of Nutrition. Not one. So here we are, just to define the problem a little bit better. We're not teaching nutrition in medical schools. We're not actually doing the research in this field to advance the cause of what nutrition is. That's the state of affairs. This, of course, is occurring at a time, too, when we spend so much money on trying to keep ourselves well. Now, as far as nutrition is concerned, I'm sure you find this not surprising. I'm talking about a whole food, plant-based diet. Vegetables, fruits, grains, legumes, the kind of stuff that Dr. Shatani and Dr. Heydrich are talking about and have been talking about for years. We know this here is really where it's at. It's those foods that provide the kind of nutrition that I'm talking about that can really help us out. Basically, it's not quite the word vegetarian. Vegetarian is a fine word, you know, and we have in the vegetarian community sort of advanced the cause of this. I do have to point out, though, I don't know how many here would agree with me on this, but 90%, according to surveys, 90% of vegetarians are still using dairy and dairy products. And some are, in fact, using fish occasionally, some chicken, and still call themselves vegetarian. I think we're going in the right direction when we take that stance, but as long as 90% of the vegetarians are still using dairy and things like that, they're not really where we need to be. When I'm talking about the whole food, plant-based diet idea, it's not really vegan, because vegan, okay, most of the people who became sort of vegan, if you will, became vegan for ideological reasons in large measure. They don't want to use animals. That's a fair and a good idea. They don't want to use animals for food. But in reality, what has happened, if you look at the data for both vegetarians and vegans, in terms of nutrient composition, the typical vegan diet on average has a fat intake about 30% of calories. Also, a lot of vegans tend to use a lot of processed foods. So it turns out that, unfortunately, we're using refined carbohydrates and sugar and white flour along with the fat. I want to shift the emphasis somewhat, still maybe using those words from time to time, but shift the emphasis to what, in fact, science really supports. And that's the whole food, plant-based diet. Also, this is not about nutrient supplements. I have been actually quite closely associated with that industry, not in the industry, but associated with it, because when the industry really got going back in the 1980s, as a result of a report that I co-authored with the National Academy of Science, that's where it really got started. Claims started to be made about these nutrient supplements. They can do this, they can do that, they can do other things. The National Academy of Science took the industry to court, and actually to the Federal Trade Commission, complaining about their claims. And they asked me to be the chief witness in their behalf. And I have to tell you, that's a sordid story, leading people to believe, here's where you can get good nutrition. All you need to do is to take these good nutrients out of food and put them in pills. Doesn't work. It doesn't work. Even though today we have an industry that's worth about $32 billion a year. I argue that nutrient supplements is not about nutrition. Nutrient supplements is about pharmacology. Also, I'm talking about something that's not integrative medicine, it's not alternative medicine, and it certainly is not functional medicine, which is sort of a big topic of the present day. Those kind of words, those kind of ideas and sense are still, it's shying away from what we really should be looking at, and that is whole plant-based foods. It's also not about low-carb diets. I'm sure you don't find that very surprising. Low-carb diets come under various and sundry names. They've been very popular with the public, starting with Dr. Atkins' book in 1973, and then many books published after that with the Atkins label on it. It's not about the South Beach diet. It's not about the paleo diet, which is the big item these days. It's not about the zone diet, blood type, wheat belly, whatever. All of those diets are the same thing. They're preaching the same thing. They just change the names around. Changing the chairs on the deck of the Titanic really is what they're doing. You know, trying to, in a sense, what they're trying to do is escape and run from the kind of thing I'm talking about. Here's a scale of things I'm trying to illustrate here. Here's a scale of things comparing the low-carb diet you see at the bottom. This is the carbohydrate content of a low-carb diet. It's somewhere around 15 to 20%. At least that's what they say they would like to have us use. And then at the top, the whole food plant-based diet. See how far apart we are? Opposite ends of the spectrum. And let me just add this comment here, and I'll come back to it in a moment. The diet, the ability of food and the diet to actually contribute to health is best estimated by the nutrient composition of the diet. How much fat, how much protein, how much carbohydrate, how much this, how much that. When you put that whole package together, that sort of describes what I'm talking about in terms of health consequences. But on that scale too, I also wanted to add this a little bit here too. You can see the whole food plant-based diet at the top, being obviously high in carbohydrate. We're a high carb diet. They're talking about a low carb diet. Vegetarian diets, vegan diets, if you will, it's up there. It's certainly far better than the low carb thing for sure. It's even a little bit higher than the standard American diet, so-called SAD diet. But there's not too much difference. There's not too much difference. If these people who were talking about the low carb diet had been truly honest what they were talking about, they should have said, we're for a high protein, high fat diet. Because if we're really down around 15, 20% carbohydrate, then the rest of it has to be fat and protein. That's what they're talking about, and that's what they're trying to advance, and that's what they're trying to defend. We should consume more protein, more fat. And I can tell you that's a disaster. That is totally a disaster. But that's one thing. On the other hand, when they were talking about low carb diet, if they had have said, and sometimes they do, they hint at it, but not totally, if they had have said that they really meant refined carbohydrates, like sugar and white flour and stuff like that. If that's what they're meaning, I buy it. In other words, we should cut down on the refined carbohydrates. But when you're consuming whole foods, you get all the carbohydrate, all the natural stuff. That's where carbohydrates come from. So when I talk about a whole food, plant-based diet, I'm talking about a diet really high in carbohydrates. The total package, the natural carbohydrates, not the refined carbohydrates, of course. Two issues that tend to confuse all of us, whether we're in favor of eating plants or whether we're in favor of eating animal-based foods. The first assumption, protein consumption is overemphasized. We've been doing that for 100 and whatever it is, 75 years or more, ever since protein was first discovered in 1839. They didn't have a name for it. They came up with a word taken from the Greek word proteos, P-R-O-T-E-I-O-S. And that means of prime importance. And so everybody wanted to get more protein, more the better, if you will. So that's where we were. There was a bit of mythology that arose at that time. And then, and still unfortunately too much to these days, protein was considered to be synonymous with meat. Meat, protein, same thing. I think many of you appreciate that. And so in the early days, it was only thought to be present in meat. And about 40, 50 years later, it was pretty well established that plants had protein too. And so now we had this kind of awareness. This is around the early 1900s. It kind of crept into our discussion, the idea that protein in animal-based foods were higher quality, and in plant-based foods, lower quality. So, in a sense, this protein story still got associated with animal-based foods, and especially because it was higher quality. That term quality never should have been chosen, that word. So if protein is not so good, why would we want to use it more efficiently? So this term of quality, I'd like to set that aside. We don't need to be concerned ourselves with the idea that animal protein is higher quality. Now, I came into this field, as I mentioned earlier, from the other point of view. I was raised on a farm, as probably many of you may know. That's me there, as I like to say, like to think maybe 8 or 9 years ago, in the front of the combine. I was raised on a dairy farm, milking cows. And to the extent I ever heard any words about protein, I mean about nutrition, I can't say I did, but to whatever extent that milk was good for us, it was in fact discussed in the context in those days of being a good source of protein, especially high quality protein. So I went away to school and, you know, as I say, I can't put my finger on exactly what I did know or didn't know, but I was in the mainstream. I was in the mainstream. I went to graduate school then, and you can see on the right, and actually got engaged in a project of doing research in order to show that protein is good stuff. We need to figure out ways of producing more of it. It's so great, we have to do that, and that's what my doctoral dissertation was about, trying to promote and advance the cause of protein in the world. Then I got involved in the Philippines for about 10 years, working with the State Department, and we were organizing there a nationwide program for feeding malnourished children. And in those days, those of us in the field were aware, supposed to be aware at least, that the problem with poor countries and the malnourished children in those poor countries, the real problem they were suffering was the fact they weren't getting enough protein. I kind of got on that bandwagon too. I mean, that's what everybody sort of thought, you know. So we went to the Philippines to make sure they got enough protein. We were setting up so-called mothercraft centers all over the country and making, especially in the poor areas, to make sure they got enough protein. You see how the story is, it's all about protein. I'm part of it, essentially. But then I happened to have seen, or thought I saw, totally anecdotal, this is not real science, this is just getting the impression, and some of this work, and without telling you all the details, I got the impression that children coming from families, the few families consuming the most protein, children coming from those families were at a higher risk of getting primary liver cancer. Now, that's kind of crazy. I had an interest in liver cancer at the same time. How can higher protein consumption be associated with liver cancer? Then there was this paper that came out from India, experimental animals at the time that was done, where they were actually checking, they were seeing that maybe protein has something to do with liver cancer caused by a chemical. a carcinogen, if you will. So they wanted to do this experiment. They had two groups of animals. They fed them different levels of protein, the higher levels, the lower levels. Both animals were predisposed to get liver cancer. And the ones that fed the higher levels of protein, the regular levels, yes, 100% got the cancer. And the others on the low level did not. I mean, that's a huge difference. You don't need a statistician to tell that difference. The thing is, though, that those Indian workers at that time, when they published that work, didn't believe it themselves. Because the whole idea that protein might turn on cancer, that was just too odd for them to accept. So they went back and they did some other studies to try to skirt around that. And it wasn't until about 25 years after that time when I was invited to India to speak at that institute, and I reminded them, hey, I took the other path. What you had there was for real. But in any case, that idea, coming from the children, more protein, more cancer, and from these experimental animal studies from India, sort of supporting that idea, that's what started my research program in the very beginning. So I went and got myself a grant from NIH, from the National Cancer Institute. That program, actually, we had it then for the next 27 years. And we did lots and lots of research. This is simply a little plot here showing what happens when experimental animals, I know this is not kosher to be necessarily talking about these in these days, but this is how I learned it and this is what we did. Two groups of animals fed 5% or 20%. I wanted to see what really happened in a biochemical sense, in physiological sense. And so in this plot here, you can see over the first 12 weeks of the cancer beginning to grow. These are animals that already have been mutated to cause the liver cancer possibly to grow. The animals that are fed the higher levels of protein, the cancer is growing rather well, really quite well. The animals fed 5%, not. Again, here this was a repeat. In fact, what I saw the Indian workers had found, what they tended not to believe. The higher levels of protein, both animals were equally disposed to get liver cancer. But the ones fed the higher protein levels, they got it, the others did not. What the Indian workers had first found was correct. And then we did something else. We wanted to see what would happen if we changed the protein level in this particular situation. So here's it. First 3 weeks, the cancer is growing quite well with 20% protein. Then you switch the diet to 5%. Turn the cancer off. Back to 20%, back on. 5%, turn it off. This led to a concept that became actually fundamental to my thinking in those days. Namely, that cancer can occur not only because of the chemicals in food, if you will, that we might get exposed to. In fact, that doesn't have much to do with it, to be honest about it. Or it doesn't occur only because of some radiation or because of viruses or because of this or that. Viruses can contribute, I should say. But what this was showing, and this was a new idea at the time, at least for me, and I think it was for anyone in the field, cancer is a product of nutrition. That's at least what we were seeing here. You consume diets higher in protein, cancers grow. You cut it down, turn it off. And so too, we did that with dietary fat. And we did too, to some extent, we did it with other kinds of nutrients. And so the whole concept of cancer for me became a disease process that went forward or didn't go forward or maybe got reversed as a function of nutrition. As a function of nutrition, instead of chemical carcinogens and things like that. Now, it turned out that the protein we were using was cow's milk protein, the main protein of cow's milk. That's why I sort of reminded you I came from a dairy farm. This is pretty hard for me to really come to terms with in a sense. Casein, the main protein of cow's milk, we were using that to turn the cancer on. That didn't, I mean, that was a little bit beyond the pale in a sense. I said the second purpose of doing this early work was to find out what's the mechanism. And of all the things I think we did research over the years that really was fundamental in a sense, I think this may have been the most significant of all. When a drug is approved and we use it, we like to know what the mechanism is. What's the biochemical mechanism? Is it this enzyme or that one, or is it this hormone or that one, or some other biological? But we like to know what the mechanism is. That's fundamental to the entire pharmaceutical company, or the pharmaceutical enterprise. in a sense. They liked when they were inventing new drugs, they first identify a drug that looks like it's doing okay, then they go and do some work to find out what the mechanism is, and so the drug can target that mechanism in a sense. That's the way it really works. So I was looking for the mechanism. Still, you know, I'm a little bit doubtful and almost wanted to see the opposite in a sense from my own background, but so we're looking for the mechanism. And here is basically just a quick summary of a huge amount of research done over about 15 years with lots of students. Cancer, as that line shows there, is intended to show how cancer is initiated. This is true for all kinds of cancer, us and the other animals. It gets initiated in the beginning. And the initiation has to do with a mutation. A chemical comes in and zaps the genetic material. Maybe it converts the normal cell to the cancer cell. It's that initiating event. Chemicals, maybe in some cases viruses, maybe radiation. In any case, that's the first step. So we looked at the first step, this initiation period, to see what effect protein had. And there you can see it listed at the top of the line, just a number of things we actually did research on. So we found mechanism number one, the high protein increases the rate of entry of the carcinogen into the cell. It does that. We were able to show that. It increased at certain enzymes. That's critical in all of this stuff. Now I don't want to get into that. It increased the synthesis, it altered their structure, did this and that. The protein was actually enhancing the ability of the carcinogen that might be used to initiate the whole thing, enhancing the ability of the carcinogen to cause cancer, start things off. So then we went to the second phase, which is called promotion. After a normal cells convert to a cancer cell, then they start to grow. They divide. You know, 1 becomes 2, becomes 4, 8, so forth and so on. It starts multiplying, dividing like that. And so that may take years in the case of humans. It's the growth period of cancer. It starts out from a nascent little pre-neoplastic or pre-cancer cell, and so it starts growing like that. That's the promotion period. And so we started looking, what's the mechanism there? And it turned out every time we looked for a mechanism, it finally became frustrating. Because every time we looked for a mechanism, we found one. So finally it occurred to me, you know, nutrition doesn't work this way. Nutrients don't work that way. They don't affect just one, they affect a whole tsunami of mechanisms that tend to produce the subsequent response. And that then led to some ideas I've had more recent years having to do with the holistic effect of nutrition. Now I said we were using casein. We actually said, okay, along the way, casein is turning on cancer. We're convincing ourselves it really does. And it's very potent to do that. And I actually got to a point where if, in fact, we follow the rules of deciding what's a carcinogen in our environment, which is not, and we have formal procedures to do that, I should tell you. And all of that research, all those conclusions are drawn from experimental animal studies, in case you do not know that. But in any case, we tend to identify carcinogens causing this kind of cancer, that kind of cancer, makes headlines. But in any case, if we use the criteria that's used to decide what's a carcinogen, what's not, I'm going to say the most significant chemical carcinogen ever identified is casein. And here it is, the main protein in cows. That is really provocative. And I'm sure you can appreciate that. But in any case, we turned our attention then to say, okay, this is what casein does, and there's reason to believe that all animal proteins will tend to operate in this way, and depend that without getting into it. We tried a couple of plant proteins, soy protein and wheat protein. Even when fed up to higher levels, it did not turn on cancer. So here we had this idea. We had this casein, an animal protein, and we had over here some plant proteins, and they were just like that, just entirely different. Casein is higher quality, it's used more efficiently. Yeah, we say that, but it causes cells to divide faster. It also causes normal cells to divide faster. Animal protein does that. Good for growing pigs, growing animals faster on the farm. But while we're increasing the rate of the cells dividing, that same protein, that same animal protein also increases the rate of division of cancer cells too. That's what we now know. And it does it through the production of hormones and other enzyme activities that go on. So this whole idea that casein, it doesn't operate alone, it's indicative of, it's simply a model of a larger arena of animal proteins in general having this kind of properties. This is a colleague of mine, my late friend, Ken Carroll from Western Ontario, and here's what he did. He was interested in what all different kinds of proteins might do to affect blood cholesterol levels. You know, higher cholesterol means more heart disease, right? And assume that that's what was generally understood at the time. So he tried a bunch of different proteins in their ability to increase blood cholesterol. Blood cholesterol is on the y-axis on the left. And there's two different groups of proteins here, it turns out. On the left, those are all the animal proteins. They tend to increase blood cholesterol. Plant proteins are associated with lower levels of blood cholesterol. That kind of got ignored. People didn't pay a lot of attention to it because we're busy all the time thinking that cholesterol goes up. You know, if we consume more cholesterol, it goes up if we consume more fat. So we should go to low-fat diets. I mean, that's a big history there. It turns out it's not just the fat. In fact, the fat has little to do with it. It's the animal protein that causes the cholesterol levels to go up. And when the cholesterol levels goes up, it increases the development of early heart disease, which we call atherogenesis. So here's another thing about casein. It's turning on cancer. It's also turning on the development of heart disease as well, through an increase in cholesterol. And those kinds of studies really were quite old. Here's a clear demonstration here, for example, if you compare casein with soy. Anyhow, they compared this back in the 19-teens and 1920s, really quite clearly, and this is research that subsequently got totally forgotten, ignored. Here's a quote: "This elevation of blood cholesterol in the diet is directly referable to the excess of protein in the diet and not to its cholesterol content." That just, I have to tell you, that really got forgotten for all these years. And that's a whole story into itself. It seems like, and I'll just mention this without documenting all of it, it turns out through science in the last 100 years or more, every time we study something about protein, especially animal protein, if it looks like it's doing something good, we remember it and we tell the world. If we show something that's not so good, we ignore it. In other words, there's this bias, this collective bias in our minds, somehow that protein is it, especially protein from animal foods, that's it. And we just tend to ignore the observations to the contrary. These individuals in 1926 or 23 in an earlier paper, they actually acknowledged some work that was done as early as 1909 by a Russian. He said this: they said Ignatowski, and the Russian researcher who used meat, milk, and eggs, attributed this effect to animal protein. Actually, there's some other very significant conclusions drawn at that time in early history. The problem with our diet is animal protein. Has anyone ever asked you, where do you get your protein from? That's part of that discussion I'm referring to. The answer is you get all the protein you need, you get the ideal levels of protein from plants, period. Going back to those experimental animal studies I was talking about before, about dietary protein and early cancer. In this particular case, what you can see here, we were using 5%, 20%, high, low, right? I wanted to know what was going on in between, so we did 4, 6, 8, 10. We did some things like this, and you can see the shape of the curve. The shape of the curve in this case is very significant. We call it, a hockey stick effect. Here we see that protein fed up to about 10% of the diet of the total calories, even if it's animal protein. It doesn't increase cancer risk. Cancers don't grow, up to about 10%. So the effect of the protein on developing cancer occurs only when the protein is fed at the higher levels. And what does that mean? I want to take that plot there, that protein is an essential nutrient. I don't want you to think that what I'm saying here is that protein is bad. No, I don't. We need protein. That's not the issue. We need it up to a certain level. If we didn't have protein, we'd die. That's how important it is. We need protein, but we only need it up to a certain level. Unfortunately, 95% of us have gone beyond that level, and we get into difficulty. We start turning on heart disease, we start turning on cancer, so forth and so on. That's what this here tends to show. And you see here on the left-hand side is disease risk. And what I'm putting there is things like heart disease, cancer, even diabetes, I won't argue, or other markers of disease that might be there. So anything that is associated with disease risk, increased disease risk is shown on the left. And across the top, I'm showing this in reference to dietary protein intake. So as protein is increased, you see you get more disease risk of various and sundry kinds. Now, let's go back and wrap this up in some detail. A little bit of details here is important. The question is really, how much protein do we actually need? Everybody's always asking, how much protein does it? He said it's 50 grams an hour for us, and so forth and so on. Let me show you what the data really show. And this starts maybe 75, 80 years ago. The minimum protein needed by humans is in the neighborhood of around 6-7%. That's the amount of protein required to simply to meet the losses of protein in the form of nitrogen in the earth. That study was actually done on people, young men actually at the time. It's been repeated in various and sundry ways since. So it's been generally accepted all these years. The minimum level of protein we need is around 5-6%. Now, when they did that experiment, they wanted to talk about how does this relate to the larger population. So, any of you familiar with statistical probabilities and so forth and so on, if 5 or 6% is the minimum we need, like the bell-shaped curve around it, if you will, they added 2 standard deviations to that to make sure that, in theory, 98% of the rest of the population would get enough protein. So, when they did that, that came up with a recommended dietary allowance, RDA. How many of you here are nutritionists in training? Nutrition counselors or such? Some of you, yeah. Well, in any case, the RDA has been sacrosanct. It's been part of our language for a long time. Now it's referred to as RDI and so forth and so on, but recommended dietary allowance. When they add 2 standard deviations to the minimum, now you come up with a recommended levels around 8, 9, 10%. Now in theory, if you're consuming a diet that's got 8 or 9, 10%, all of us, according to this kind of analysis, this kind of reasoning, all of us should be getting enough protein. And in fact, we're getting kind of, in a sense, ideal levels of protein if we're thinking about cancer. Well, what do we do as a society? Our average protein intake is not 9 or 10%, it's around 17 to 18%. Now, how do we get up to 17 to 18%? Let me show you how we got up there. First off, if you're consuming a whole food plant-based diet, you're going to get all the protein you need. It's easily going to cover that 8 or 9 or 10%. So plants as a whole food provides all the protein we need. As we increase the animal protein in the diet, we're actually increasing calories too. And we have a ceiling about the number of calories we tend to consume. We increase animal protein, and what happens when we do that? We actually decrease the consumption of plant foods. That's a big deal. So by substituting, by putting in the animal protein into our diet, we're getting penalized now in 2 ways. First off, the protein itself is doing a lot of damage. It increases the rate of aging. It increases cancer. It increases heart disease. It turns on hormones that actually cause kind of mischief. So why does that matter? Whether we eat animal foods or plant foods. You may remember I said the best indication of the health value of food is the nutrient composition. What do they have in general? Here's the difference between animal foods and plant foods. Look at that. I just picked out 5 groups of nutrients here. Antioxidants are really only made in plants. If I were to pick out a group of nutrients that has all of it, the best thing to think about is antioxidants. Antioxidants are key. They're made basically only in plants. Complex carbohydrates are very important, especially for gastrointestinal health. That includes fiber and all the good stuff like that, essentially. Those two things, antioxidants, complex carbohydrates, that's what we need. We need that critically. It's only made in plants, basically. Vitamins, I'm going to do a little bit technical argument here, and I won't get into the details of it, but I'm going to argue that vitamins, as they are defined, are only provided by plants. Okay? So that's what a plant-based diet does. It has all the good stuff in it. It has some protein too. It's got around 9-10% protein and 9-10% fat. Turns out, what I just showed you, that's the amount of protein we need. So all of a sudden you start looking at this on a broader scope. Plants got it. They've got it all. As long as you got some variety and vegetables, fruits, and grains and stuff like that. There's another one here too. We like to talk about processed foods, and that comes back to the vegan question, but that's not just vegans, it's actually everyone. We're consuming too much of the made-up foods. Cookies and cakes and so forth and so on like this, that's rich in the sugars, and even white flours and cakes and stuff like this. Even though all that stuff may have come from plants, you know, and so this is where, unfortunately, vegans get the difficulty, because they look at the punch and say, oh, it doesn't have any animal food in it, this might be okay. And, you know, we're all addicted to this, you know, high fat, high sweet tooth, if you will. So we eat that kind of food. And so in that kind of case, we're displacing the consumption of what really matters. What really matters is the whole food plant-based material. The health of vegans is better. That's really quite consistent. The health is definitely better. Lower heart disease risk, lower cancer, more or less. But the amount of decrease that occurs under those circumstances, I'm going to argue, is kind of small compared to what it could be. That's what I'm really saying. So vegan diets, vegetarian diets, in a sense, are going in the right direction, yes. We're making that kind of improvement. But if we really want to get to where health is dramatically improved, we've got to do the whole thing. The other problem is that we have tended to rely too much on nutrient supplements, as I mentioned before. In a larger context, what this means is this. We tend to think about nutrition in terms of how much of this nutrient, and that nutrient, and some other nutrient has. You know, we look at the labels and boxes that this nutrient and so forth and so on. We judge our food by exactly how much it has. And we worry about, did we get enough milligrams of this or enough grams of that? Well, all that focus has led to putting those nutrients in pills, call them supplements. Now we know it doesn't really work. As I say, I know something about this because this came up with the National Academy of Science report in 1982 that I was a co-author of, that we were the first to say to reduce fat down to 30% of calories. I actually wanted to go lower on the committee. There were 13 of us. They argued that if we went lower, that would cut into animal protein consumption. And they've been all over the place. And people think they're getting healthy, and now they can eat whatever they want to eat and use their nutrient supplement. That's the problem. 67 randomized trials published in 2008 involving 250,000 people. That's a big, big study. They concluded there's no evidence to support antioxidant supplements to prevent mortality in healthy people or patients with various diseases. They're being kind of coy here, they're being conservative in their wording, but their conclusion was that basically they don't work. And some of these supplements actually have been shown to increase disease risk. Quite a number of them actually now. Here's a couple of examples. Vitamin E increases stroke by 74%. That's vitamin E supplements in one study. Calcium and vitamin E supplements, which are popular these days, have been shown to actually increase cardiovascular events. Vitamin E increases prostate cancer by 17%. I could give you a big long list of studies that it doesn't make the news. It doesn't make the news because we don't want the public to know that these things really aren't worth what a lot of people think they are. Omega-3 fats is the latest sort of good guy on the scene. Everybody wants to use omega-3 fats, you know the story. They get advertised every place. People like to use them in the form of fish oil or supplements or whatever, what have you. Here's a summary in 2006. Summarized 89 studies involving 600,000 people taking omega-3 fat supplements in one form or another. It says omega-3 fats do not have a clear effect on total mortality combined cardiovascular events for cancer. And even the possibility, allowed for the possibility, actually increased, taking omega-3 supplements actually increases cancer risk. It didn't quite reach the level of statistical significance, but it's worrisome. It sure didn't decrease cancer risk. So my question is, why are we taking these omega-3 supplements? That was 2006. That information is huge. This is not a study. This is 89 studies combined. How come that information hasn't filtered down to the public? How come doctors haven't been told this? Here's one on type 2 diabetes. Omega-3 fats have now been shown in this huge study here again, almost 10,000 type 2 diabetic cases, 3 million person-years worth of follow-up. You can see there, as omega-3 supplementation is gradually increased from a standard of 1 to 5% increase, 17% increase, 24% increase, as you increase the consumption of omega-3 fats, type 2 diabetes risk goes up. So 2 ideas. You get all the protein we need from plant foods, and that has major consequences. Not only avoiding the excessive direct effects of protein, but also avoiding, restoring our consumption of foods that matter. The second thing is, as I say, we should not be assuming that single nutrients is where the answer is. The answer is this, and I don't have a chance to get into it, but it's the subject of the second book I wrote called Whole. Everything is working together, and when you start looking at that question that way, it's so overwhelming. It's so overwhelming that consuming a whole food, plant-based diet without adding back a lot of salt, sugar, and fat. Amazing things can happen in 10 days' time for people who have problems. This is Dr. Esselstyn, my good friend and colleague. We lecture together quite a bit. Dr. Esselstyn at the Cleveland Clinic. I think he's been out here, he's lectured, many of you may have heard of him. Here's his latest publication just about 2 months ago. He brings them in, he spends about 5 hours with them, together with his wife, Anne, who sort of shows people how to eat food as well. So Dr. Esselstyn and his wife have been doing this with the patients that they get from time to time who actually have heart problems, not too long ago. And that's all he ever said to them. He goes back then, about a year or so ago, he calls them up on the phone, he says, "Are you still doing what I told you to do?" It turns out of the 198 that he was able to locate, of those 198, 177 of them say, "Yeah, we're still doing it," with themselves. 89% of the people who were given that minimal information over a 5-hour period stayed with it. Only one person out of the 177, a friend of mine who I sent there, he was said that he followed the diet, but his wife said he didn't. I believe wives. In any case, this is so dramatic. The ones who did not follow his advice, the 21 who did not follow his advice, 62% of those people had a subsequent heart attack, including some deaths. The ones who did follow it, they did not. And I think it's fair to make this statement here at the top. A whole food plant-based diet prevents, yes, if you will, but it prevents, it suspends, it stops the development of diseases and or cures these. When I say cure, first off, this kind of diet is very broad in its effect. This is not like the drug philosophy. Drug philosophy, you make a chemical, you target it to an event, and you give it. So it's targeted drug therapy. That's the mantra of the day. This dietary thing, very natural. It's nature at work. It has a broad effect. It's also very rapid. It's very fast. We can't use this diet in a sense of, oh, I got myself a problem, I'm going to do this diet for a week or so. You have to get there and stay there. I'm really confident we can actually save minimum 60 to 70% of the total health care costs. And we can do it really quickly. We offer 30 Category 1 continuing education credits for doctors, so it's kind of neat. It works really quite well. And Cornell, actually now, the online program at Cornell is generally considered to be one of the best in the country. They're offering 200 and some courses. Ours is number 1 of the 200. That's how much interest is that. And one more thing. How many have seen Forks Over Knives? Oh, wow. Wow. In any case, we've got another movie. The name of the film is Plant Purification. And I have to tell you, however successful Forks Over Knives has been, and I know it's been quite successful, we've got to sit down, work out together to advance this cause, just to solve problems for our entire societies, not only in the United States, but the world at large. Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. T. Colin Campbell, for an immensely informative and awesome presentation. I'd like to invite all of you now to get some of those great refreshments from Down to Earth over in the kitchen there. Thank you again for coming, and have a safe return home. Good night, everyone.
This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. Free monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.